Welcome to the People Teaching People podcast. I'm so glad that you're here. I want to start with a question. When was the last time someone asked you a really good question? Not just something quick or surface level, but a question that made you pause. The kind that stays with you a little longer than expected and shifts how you're thinking, even just slightly. Sometimes questions don't just move a conversation forward, they shape it. Sometimes they even change it. And that's really what I want to explore today. Questions are such a natural part of how we learn and connect with each other that it's easy to overlook just how much they're doing. We ask them all the time. We answer them all the time. But when you start to slow down and pay attention, you begin to notice that questions are doing so much more than simply filling space. They guide attention, shape thinking, and influence how people experience learning. In many ways, they are not just part of the learning process, they are critical to the learning process. You may have heard the phrase, there's no such thing as a dumb question. And I understand the intention behind that. It's meant to create safety and to encourage people to speak up. But I also think it's worth exploring that idea a little more closely. Because while there may not be dumb questions in the sense of curiosity or not knowing, there are different kinds of questions. Some open things up and invite people in, while others can shut things down or take that learning in a really different direction. Sometimes it's not even the question itself, but how it's asked or when it's asked that changes how it lands. So instead of thinking about questions as good or bad or dumb, it can be more helpful to think about them as intentional or unintentional. Are they helping us understand something more deeply? Are they connected to what we're trying to do? Are they creating space for thinking or shutting it down? When you start to look at questions through that lens, something shifts. You move from simply asking questions to designing them. This is where questions become a really important part of learning design. When you're planning a learning experience, questions don't have to be something you come up with on the spot. They can be thought about ahead of time and really shaped with purpose and woven into the experience in a way that supports how people move through their learning. Often there is a bigger question sitting at the center. This question highlights what I like to call the big idea of the learning opportunity. Something that invites exploration and gives the learning direction. From there, other questions begin to unfold, helping people move towards that big idea by building understanding, connecting ideas, and applying what they're learning in ways that feels meaningful to them. When this happens, the learning starts to feel more connected. There's a sense that things are building rather than just being presented, and people are able to follow the thinking while also becoming part of it. This is where questions begin to transform a learning experience from something that feels passive into something that feels active. Instead of simply receiving information, people are engaging with it, working through it, and making sense of it in their own way. There's also something really powerful in the way questions are phrased. For example, there's a difference between asking why and asking how or what if. Depending on the context, why questions can sometimes feel heavy or even a bit confrontational, while how and what if questions tend to open things up and invite exploration. A small shift in wording can completely change the tone of the interaction, moving from something like, why didn't you finish? To what helped you complete the part you did? Or what might help you take the next step? Creates a very different experience for the person responding. There's also a connection here to how we support different levels of thinking and learning. You may have heard of Bloom's taxonomy, which is essentially a way of describing how thinking can move from more surface level understanding to deeper, more complex thinking. At one level, questions might focus on recalling information or explaining an idea. And then as you move further along, questions begin to invite people to apply what they know, to analyze, to evaluate, and even to create something new. When we're intentional about the questions we ask, we can actually support that progression. Instead of staying at the level of, what is this? Or can you define this? We can begin to ask, how would you use this? Or what do you notice here? Or what might you do differently in this situation? And suddenly the learning deepens. So it's not just about asking questions, it's about asking questions that move thinking forward. Questions don't just gather information, they shape how people feel in the learning and how deeply they engage with it. They can build confidence or create hesitation. They can invite participation or make someone pause. And so much of that comes down to intention. When a question is grounded in genuine curiosity, when it reflects care and a sense of commitment to the person or the process, people can feel that. And that's where trust begins to build. With this podcast, before every guest conversation, I spend time preparing. And a big part of that preparation is asking my guests some questions ahead of time through a Google form. I ask about their story, their work, what they care about, and what they would love to talk about. I also ask them what questions they get asked most often, their FAQs. What's interesting is how much those questions shape the conversation before it even begins. They help ensure that what we talk about reflects who they are, not just what I think might be important to cover. In a way, the questions become part of the design of the conversation itself, and they allow me to listen more intentionally once we're actually in it. At the same time, when we hit record, I'm not set on asking those questions exactly as I've written them, or in a particular order, or even at all. I'm listening. I'm paying attention to what's being shared at that moment, and I'm engaging with it. Sometimes the conversation goes in a completely different direction than I expected, and we end up exploring something more deeply than I had planned. And that's often where the real magic happens. It's in those moments where a follow-up question just naturally emerges, where something unexpected comes up, or where there's space to stay with an idea a little longer. The preparation matters, but so does the flexibility. It's not about sticking to the questions, it's about using them as a guide while still leaving room for curiosity, connection, and where the conversation wants to go. I've seen the same idea show up in my work beyond the podcast with my colleague at the ARIS Hub at SAIT. When we were developing a framework for student engagement in applied research, our starting point wasn't answers, it was curiosity. We asked questions of researchers, instructors, and students. We explored their experiences, what was working, what they were running into in terms of challenges, and what support they needed. And then we listened. What came out of that process wasn't just a framework built on assumptions. It was a framework shaped by what people actually shared. It became a response to those questions. And even now, it continues to evolve through ongoing questions, which is part of what keeps it relevant and meaningful. Questions are also one of the most practical ways to understand how learning is unfolding in real time. You might hear this described as formative assessment, which simply means checking in on learning as it's happening rather than waiting until the end, which would be more summative assessment. And how we invite responses when we're talking about formative assessment really matters. Not everyone feels comfortable answering a question in a large group setting. For some people, that can feel like a lot of pressure. This is something I've thought about often when I was teaching. There were times where instead of asking for a verbal response, I would invite students to show their thinking in a different way. A thumbs up or thumbs down to check for understanding. Holding up 1 to 5 fingers to indicate their answer from a multiple choice list of options, or using mini whiteboards to share a response to something like a chemistry calculation. Because, yes, in my former life, I was a junior high and high school science teacher. What I found was that more students participated when the barrier to entry was lower. It gave me a clearer sense of understanding across the room while also allowing students to engage without feeling put on the spot. It shifted the experience from performance to participation. There's also something to be said about timing. We don't always give people enough time to think. It's very natural to ask a question and then move quickly to fill the silence. But that pause, even just a few seconds longer than feels comfortable, can make a big difference. It gives people space to process and respond more thoughtfully. And sometimes questions don't come up in the moment at all. They come later, after someone has had time to reflect and step away and make connections. When we create opportunities for questions to be shared beyond the moment through follow-up conversations, email, online discussion spaces, we're recognizing that learning doesn't stop when the session ends. It continues. Sometimes people are hesitant to ask questions. They might feel like they're the only one who doesn't understand something, or they might worry about how it will sound. There's often a quiet pressure to just go along with things. This is something I saw quite often when I was teaching. But when a student would finally ask a question, sometimes a little hesitantly, almost immediately you could feel the shift in the room. Other students would lean in and you'd see nodding. Because more often than not, if one person has a question, they are not the only one. That question was just waiting for someone to say it out loud. Creating a learning environment where questions are welcomed isn't just about encouraging people to ask. It's about designing an experience where it feels safe to do so, where curiosity is part of the culture, where not knowing is part of the process, and where learning is something people can move through together. Of course, questions don't just belong in formal learning environments. They show up everywhere in our day-to-day interactions all the time. In conversations with colleagues, in meetings, in how we support someone who is figuring something out, and of course, even in how we connect with our families and friends. And in those moments, the questions we ask shape more than just the conversation. They shape how someone thinks, how they process what's in front of them, and even how they see themselves in that moment. For example, there's a difference between asking someone if something is done and asking what their step might be. One is focused on completion, the other invites reflection and ownership. In a meeting, asking, "Does anyone have any questions?" often leads to silence, but shifting that slightly to something like, "What's something you're thinking about right now?" or "What feels worth exploring a little bit more?" can open the door in a very different way. These are small shifts, but they change the experience from something transactional to something more thoughtful and engaged. You can see this in everyday conversations. When someone shares something they're working through, there's a natural pull to respond with advice or a solution. But a question like, "What have you already tried?" or "What feels most important to you right now?" creates space for them to think it through in their own way. It shifts the dynamic from telling to exploring. And that shift matters because the questions we ask don't just move things forward, they shape how people participate in the process. There's also something interesting to consider here when it comes to curiosity over time. Young children ask hundreds of questions a day. as they make sense of the world. They are constantly noticing, wondering, and trying to close the gaps in their understanding. But as we get older, that can tend to decrease. Not because curiosity disappears, but because the environments we move through don't always make space for those questions in the same way. And yet, when you look at adult environments, especially in workplaces, there's growing recognition of how important questions are. Research has shown that people who ask more questions, particularly follow-up questions, are often seen as more engaged and build stronger connections with others. Not because they have all the answers, but because they're actively trying to understand. So this isn't just about teaching. It's about how we lead, communicate, support others, and continue to learn ourselves. And maybe that's the invitation here, to notice the questions we're asking in those everyday moments and to get a little more intentional with them. As well, it's about recognizing that even small shifts in how we ask can create more space for thinking, connection, and understanding. So, as you think about your own work and your day-to-day interactions, I don't know that this is about asking more questions for the sake of asking more questions. It's more about noticing the role that questions are already playing, because they're already there, woven into the way conversations begin, how we respond in the moment, and how we support or guide someone through something that they're figuring out. And when you start to pay attention to that, you may notice that even small shifts in how a question is asked can change the experience for someone else. It can make it easier to engage, to think things through, to share an idea, or even just to stay actively engaged in the learning a little bit longer. When questions are intentional, they don't just move things along, they open things up. They create space for understanding, for connection, and for something new to emerge, often in ways that we didn't fully plan for. And maybe that's the heart of it. Questions are not just something we add into our work. They are part of how we show up in it. At the beginning of this episode, I asked you to think about a really good question, one that stayed with you, one that shifted something, even just a little. And maybe now there's an opportunity to think about the other side of that. What is one question you could ask, or even stay with a little longer, that might shift the way someone else experiences learning with you? Thank you for joining me today on the People Teaching People podcast. If this episode resonated for you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to continuing to learn and to ask and answer questions together.